Somewhere along the way, people started saying faith and facts are enemies. That if you believe the Bible, you must somehow reject archaeology, history, science, logic, evidence, manuscripts, ancient records, and common sense. But here's the thing. The deeper historians dig into the ancient world, the more the dirt keeps testifying. Entire cities once mocked as myths have been uncovered. Kings the Bible mentioned before secular historians did, found. Ancient inscriptions, found. Pools, tunnels, monuments, seals, locations, civilizations, found. And maybe the most shocking part of all, even many non-Christian historians agree that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person who was crucified under Pontius Pilate. The real debate usually isn't did Jesus exist, the debate is who was he? Tonight we're not just doing blind faith, we're doing evidence. Not just Christian sources, not just pastors, not just sermons. We're going through archaeology, Roman historians, medical journals, manuscript evidence, and discoveries that continue to support biblical record. This is building a case for Christ. There's a strange assumption online that Christianity survives because people are ignorant, that believers are somehow afraid of evidence, or they are brainwashed, or a cult. But historically, Christianity exploded in the exact place where Jesus was publicly executed. Think about that. The disciples didn't preach the resurrection in another country, decades later, where nobody could fact check it. They preached it in Jerusalem, to eyewitnesses, to hostile authorities, to people who could literally walk to the tomb area. And despite persecution, torture, imprisonment, and execution, Christianity spread like wildfire. Why? Because those first believers were either lying, delusional, or telling the truth. And history gets really uncomfortable when you start to examine those options closely. One of the biggest misconceptions is that the Bible is a single random book written by one guy in medieval times. It's not. The Bible is a collection of 66 books written over roughly 1,500 years ago by dozens of authors. Shepherds, kings, fishermen, prophets, physicians, scholars, tax collectors, written across 3 continents, multiple languages, different cultures, different centuries. Yet it tells one connected narrative: creation, fall, redemption, restoration. That alone is remarkable. But critics often say, yeah, but it was copied too many times, which leads us to manuscript evidence. People often trust ancient history without realizing how little evidence exists for most ancient works. Take Homer's Odyssey, the Odyssey. The most ancient text survived through very few manuscript copies. But the New Testament? It absolutely dwarfs ancient literature and manuscript evidence. There are thousands of Greek manuscripts and tens of thousands of early translations and quotations from the Church Fathers. Historians have more manuscript evidence of the New Testament than virtually any other ancient document in the world. And here's the important part. The gap between the original writings and surviving copies is comparatively tiny by ancient standards. For many classical works, the earliest copies come hundreds or even over 1,000 years later. For the New Testament, some fragments date extremely early, meaning we can actually compare manuscripts. And when scholars compare them, the overwhelming message remains consistent. That doesn't automatically prove Christianity is true, but it absolutely destroys the claim that the Bible was rewritten so many times we have no idea what it originally said. That claim simply doesn't hold up historically. In 1947, a shepherd tossed a rock into a cave near Qumran and accidentally changed biblical studies forever. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. These scrolls included portions of the Old Testament dating over 2,000 years. Why is this massive? because critics often claim the Bible had changed dramatically over time. When scholars compare these ancient scrolls with later manuscripts, the consistency was astonishing, especially the book of Isaiah, meaning the Old Testament had been preserved with incredible accuracy across centuries. The Bible wasn't mutating into fantasy over time like a giant theological game of telephone. For years, critics claim many biblical people and places were fictional. Then archaeology kept embarrassing that claim. Let's go through some examples. In the Gospel of John, Jesus heals a man at the pool of Bethesda. Critics once mocked this location as symbolic fiction because no evidence existed. Then archaeologists found it, exactly where John described. With the unusual 5 portico structure mentioned in scriptures, suddenly the made-up story had a real location. Some skeptics once questioned whether Pontius Pilate even existed. Then in 1961, archaeologists discovered that Pilate's stone in Caesarea, an inscription bearing his name and title. The Roman governor who sentenced Jesus to death? Historical. For a long time, some scholars argued King David was mythical. Then the Tel Dan stele was discovered. It referenced the house of David, and again, the dirt kept talking. The Bible describes King Hezekiah preparing Jerusalem for invasion by constructing a tunnel to secure water. That tunnel still exists. People literally walk through it today. A lot of people assume Jesus only appears in the Bible. That's false. Multiple non-Christian sources reference him or early Christianity. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote about Christus being executed under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Tacitus hated Christians, which actually strengthens the historical value. He had zero motivation to help Christianity. The Jewish historian Josephus references Jesus and also mentions James, the brother of Jesus. Even scholars who debate parts of the passage generally agree Josephus referenced Jesus in some form. Pliny wrote about Christians worshiping Christ as divine in the early 1st century. Yes, you heard that right. The 1st century, meaning belief in Jesus' divinity emerged extremely early, not centuries later like some claim. Some people argue Jesus never actually died on the cross, but medically that theory collapses fast. The Roman crucifixion process was horrifyingly efficient. Scourging alone could kill people. Victims suffered massive blood loss, shock, asphyxiation, cardiac stress, dehydration. And according to the gospel accounts, Jesus was pierced in the side after death. Interestingly, medical experts have examined the crucifixion historically. The Journal of the American Medical Association published an analysis concluding Jesus' death by crucifixion was medically certain. Romans were execution experts. If they failed at killing prisoners regularly, Rome had a bigger problem. Now let's think logically. If the resurrection was fake, what did the disciples gain? Money? Nope. Power? Not really. Comfort? Absolutely not. Most face persecution, torture, imprisonment, or death. People will die for something they think is true, but people generally don't willingly suffer for what they know is a lie. And these were the people claiming to have seen the risen Jesus. Not decades later, not through legend, immediately. And that matters. Even many skeptical historians acknowledged several key facts. Jesus was crucified. The tomb was later claimed empty. The disciples genuinely believed they saw the risen Christ. Christianity exploded rapidly afterwards. The question becomes, what explains it? Hallucinations? Hallucinations don't usually happen in groups. A stolen body? Then why would the disciples die proclaiming resurrection? Wrong tomb? Authorities could have simply produced the body. And women being listed as the first witnesses actually strengthens the authenticity historically. Why? Because in that culture, women's testimony carried less legal weight. If you were inventing a propaganda in the first century, you likely wouldn't write women as the primary resurrection witness. Yet the gospel writers did, because they were reporting what they claimed actually happened. One modern story that impacted millions is Lee Strobel. Now, Strobel was a journalist and a former legal editor for the Chicago Tribune. Investigated Christianity after his wife became a believer. His journey became the basis for the case for Christ. Now, to be fair, critics argue Strobel mainly interviewed Christian scholars and wasn't neutral as it presented, but he did interview some non-Christians as well. But even critics generally acknowledge that Strobel helped popularize historical arguments surrounding manuscript reliability, archaeology, non-Christian sources, and the resurrection case. His story resonated because many people assume faith collapses under investigation. For Strobel, investigation strengthened it instead. One of the weirdest modern myths is that Christianity and science are opposites. Historically, many founders of the modern science believed in God. People like Newton, Kepler, Pascal. The idea was creation, reflection, order because it came from an intelligent creator. Now, obviously, Christians debate science topic today's, but the blanket statement, science disproves God, is not actually a scientific statement. Science studies natural processes. God is a philosophical and metaphysical question beyond a microscope. Science can explain how processes happen. It cannot ultimately answer why existence exists at all. Now, this section gets intense because the Old Testament contains prophecies Christians believe point towards Jesus centuries before his birth, including birthplace, suffering, betrayal, manner of death, rejection, piercing. Isaiah 53 especially shocks many people when they first read it carefully. And remember, parts of Isaiah were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, proving the text existed before Jesus' lifetime. That matters enormously. Not to mention, he talks about piercing and crucifixion before it was even a thing. At the end of all of this, the question isn't really, was there evidence? There's actually a surprising amount. The real question becomes, what do you do with it all? Because Jesus is one of the most documented ancient figures in human history. Not every detail is universally agreed upon, but the idea he was simply invented out of thin air, that position is increasingly fringe among historians. Even many skeptical scholars accept Jesus existed, he was crucified, his followers truly believed he rose again, and Christianity emerged from that explosion. So maybe faith isn't the absence of evidence. Maybe faith begins when evidence becomes impossible to ignore. The Bible has survived empires, persecutions, burnings, mockery, dictators, criticisms, centuries of attacks, and somehow it's still here. Still changing lives, still being studied, and still being debated. Still surviving every attempt to bury it. Funny enough, that sounds exactly like the story it tells. And maybe after all of this, you still don't believe. Maybe you still think the resurrection sounds impossible. And honestly, a dead man rising from the grave should sound impossible. That's the point. Christianity was never built on the claim that something ordinary happened. It was built on the claim that history itself split in two after a crucified man walked out of a sealed tomb. And for over 2,000 years, people have tried to bury that claim. Empires have tried, philosophers tried, critics tried, governments tried, scholars tried. The internet definitely tries every 5 minutes. And yet, Jesus of Nazareth remains the single influential figure in human history. Not Caesar, not Alexander the Great, not Napoleon. Jesus, a carpenter from a tiny corner of the Roman Empire who never led an army, never wrote a book, never held political office, yet changed the world so dramatically that humanity literally measures time around his life. BC and AD. Even the calendar whispers his name. And what fascinates me the most is this: the closer archaeologists dig into biblical lands, the more evidence surfaces. The closer historians examine the early church, the harder it becomes to explain away. The closer skeptics investigate the resurrection, the stranger the story gets. Because Christianity didn't begin with blind optimism. It began with terrified disciples suddenly becoming fearless. It began with people who claimed we saw him. Not a metaphor, not a spiritual feeling, not a hallucination. Him, alive. And whether someone believes that or not, history still has to wrestle with what happened next. A movement exploded from the very city where Jesus was executed. Thousands converted. Then millions, then billions across centuries. And somehow, through persecution, corruption, wars, mockery, and endless attacks, the Bible endured. Not because every Christian is perfect, far from it, but because the message survived humanity itself. And maybe that's why people still argue about Jesus more than anyone else in history. Nobody gets angry about mythological figures they don't secretly feel challenged by. People don't spend their lives fighting against someone they think is irrelevant. But Jesus? Even now, 2,000 years later, people still debate him, mock him, study him, reject him, or worship him. No one stays neutral about Christ for long. So maybe the question isn't, is there evidence? Maybe the question is, what happens if the gospel is actually true? Because if Jesus truly rose from the dead, then this isn't just another ancient story. This changes everything. And maybe that's why the world never stopped trying to silence it. Have a good day, guys. Bye.